All right, here we go.
No.
All right, yo, you tapped in with the fantasy gods. This is Justin Henry. I'm with Connor LaPlante, man,
What's up?
our stat analyst here with the fantasy gods. And today we're going to be going over some numbers and some players, some controversial players that him and I have polarizing takes on. And I think the fantasy community is pretty split on them too. Connor, my man, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Excited. Thursday night football. So.
Thank you, buddy.
All right. So we're first gonna talk about Mike Davis, right? And
Yes, sir.
so you're on the side of Cordero Patterson, right? Where
So let's kind of take a step back, I guess, for anybody who hasn't been paying attention to fantasy this year. Mike Davis was one of the most touted sleeper picks. A lot of people liked his volume, his workload, and coming into Atlanta, obviously there was a lot of touches vacated. Julio Jones left. They had no running back there. Todd Gurley was gone. So this offense looked like it was the prime setup for a running back to come in and produce, whether it was a high level or low level. The volume was there. And so obviously, Mike Davis was the lead running back in this situation. It came in, there was no viable backup running back. Cordell Patterson has been a journeyman, a receiver type, just started playing the running back role recently, has now been in that spot. So obviously the go-to for a lot of fantasy experts was to go with Mike Davis as the person there who's going to receive the touches. And so what Connor and I have differed on so far over the course of the first 4 weeks of the season is, has Mike Davis lived up to that value, and do we see a change in that moving forward? My take initially was that Mike Davis is the type of player that will lose the role eventually, just not producing at a level high enough to where he's going to compete and be the starting running back that's capable of handling the workload. Many people look to the time in Carolina where he averaged, he did pretty well using Christian McCaffrey's touches and produced at a level that was back in RB1, high end RB2 when he played. My thought was that just looking at the footage, the tape, the games that have been played so far, Cordell Patterson looked like the more explosive player, and also in PPR formats looked like the player that could get the ball in his hands, get the receiving work that's needed. Connor, my man, we've talked about this at scale numerous times. Let's go, man. Let's hear the counterpunch.
okay. So here's the deal, right? So going into the season, if you looked at, so I first want to touch on the fact that you said vacated touches in Atlanta. So that's kind of a fallacy. Like, you know, of course, when players leave, other players are going to get more opportunities, but it's not like they're taking the opportunities from the past players. Like they're completely individual with each other, and I think that gets really like confused because it's not. I don't know how to explain it so that you know it's easy to understand, but I think
Well, those touches, you're mentioning like those touches being vacated or just, I mentioned, my thought was like, okay, obviously Todd Gurley's not there no more.
yeah,
Julio Jones isn't there. And the thought with every person looking into fantasy or looking into football is like, nah, there's got to be somebody else
right,
taking
right,
those touches, right? But you're
yeah,
saying that that's wrong.
yeah. It's not really like they're taking over the old, like the touches that were last year are no longer there. The touches that are given this year are new. You know what I mean? They're not related to each other at all because the whole team's volume can change year to year too. Like that's assuming that the volume of the team stays the same, right?
That's a good
But
point.
look, generally at Atlanta, they've always been this fast-paced team where they run a lot of plays. And you saw last year, Todd Gurley had a lot of red zone attempts. So me thinking, oh, Atlanta's gonna be in a lot of situations where yeah they might be trash, they might kind of cuss. I was gonna say they might be ass, but
That's all good.
they're still gonna like have a lot of plays. Like even if they're like garbage time, whatever, more plays leads to more red zone opportunities. It's as simple as that. Like so, Mike Davis was the only back there. It's not that he's taking Gurley's touches or whatever. He's gonna get his own touches, right? Because he was only running back, right? And then you had Cordell Patterson, who was kind of a question mark. He was a wide receiver, kind of, you know, specialist kind of guy.
Right.
But going to the season, of course, it looked like Mike Davis, like he was gonna have his workhorse role. He was gonna get all the touches that you know, thought that would, produce in fantasy, right? And he still does. What you
Well,
really,
I kind of want to tap into that a little bit more because you mentioned
yeah,
like obviously the expectation coming in was like, hey, this guy's going to get the valuable touches. And I know you're big on valuable touches
yeah,
and getting those red zone looks. But to me, it was always a matter of talent too. Like he's never really had the talent that we wanted to see out of a starting running back. I know how you feel about it, but
yeah,
just hear me out. When you have a running back who's averaging less than 4 yards a carry, who doesn't get signed to a starter type contract, who
hmm
just isn't in a favorable talent situation, why doesn't that play? And for the people who are watching who don't know you, like you're very statistical, you have
yeah.
great breakdown and statistical analysts on a lot of things, and it's very valuable to the fantasy community. But why doesn't that matter or play a factor into your decision making? Because for me, as somebody who's more, I would say, on the casual side of analysis, for somebody who I'm just looking at the film, I'm looking at the game itself. I'm like, man, Mike Davis don't have it. Why does that change for you in your analysis for fantasy football?
So you're basically asking like why I don't really look at like if they're talented or not, and like having,
Why, yeah, why isn't that a factor for you? Like, because I know you value those touches more than
yeah,
you're like, all right, is it Mike Davis or is it somebody else in the same situation?
yeah. See, fantasy is very like circumstantial, like or football in general. Like if you put a trash player in a position to succeed, they're gonna, especially at running back, they're gonna succeed more than not. Like if they have a good offensive line, if they're in a good game script, that running back is gonna have a good game. Like even if they're not the best running back, like you throw Mike Davis behind one of the best offensive lines in the league, and you give him on, like you put him on a good team, and all of a sudden he's the top running back because he's the only one there, and it's like he's a workhorse. So to me, like the talent doesn't really make a difference because yards per carry, yards per attempt, it's so variable game to game. Like football as a whole sport, like if you look at it statistically, it's just a lot of randomness. So you can't really like sit here and objectively say, oh, Zeke is better than this guy, or like this running back is better than this running back. They're really at the end of the day kind of replaceable. Like the
I
difference.
don't know if you put me behind the Indiana Colt the Colts offensive line, I ain't getting
I
3
mean,
yards,
I
bro.
mean, it's a little different because you're not a football player, but like, I could easily see a team going out and getting a undrafted, free agent, right, that produced in college, and then just bringing them in. And if they have a good O line and they have a good system, like the running back will produce. You saw last year James Robinson produce. You saw last year Myles Gaskin produce. Both those guys were drafted late, undrafted. Like it doesn't matter. Like you can still be a good back without having like really high pedigree out of college, or like it's literally just situation.
Well, I look at the Niners situation, and they always, it seems like they
Yeah,
have backs that are either late round picks or undrafted, and just can come in and churn out 100 yards because of how they game plan and how they
exactly.
want to use their running backs. But then I look at Mike Davis in that same situation. I'm like, man, he didn't even produce in that situation. And you
Right.
mentioned kind of it being a variable, a variable. What about Cordero Patterson, man? Because obviously, I don't think he's. Here's my take on Cordero Patterson. I don't think he takes over in the sense. I called this actually on our fantasy guys page. If you're paying attention, I said Cordell Patterson's going to take over this backfield.
hmm
What I meant by that is not that he's going to be a 20 carry back, but what I meant by that was he's going to be the running back, quote unquote, that you want to own because of the touches. And I know that we've had a little bit of a discussion off camera about Cordero Patterson's role in his touches. Talk about how that influences your decision because obviously he's not getting the snap shares that you're wanting to see out of a running back that you consistently want on your fantasy team.
Right. If you look at his snaps, every week has been getting around 20 snaps. That's it. That's like, really low for especially somebody that's that high in fantasy ranks so far in points. He's like extremely overperformed, the amount of time he's even been on the field. You know what I mean?
And for people who don't understand how many snaps are a game, you're probably getting somewhere between 60 to 80 snaps any given game.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to pull up the snaps real quick so I can list off some players that are getting similar snaps. So last week, let's see, give me a second.
Now, do I think what Cordell Patterson is doing is unsustainable? Hell yes, I do. There's no fucking way he continues at that pace to have 20. I'm not predicting Cordero Patterson is anywhere near 10 to 15 touchdowns. If he did, I'd be shocked. But what I am predicting is that he's going to be a valuable part of this offense moving forward, more so than Mike Davis.
Okay, so I kind of get where you're coming from because if you look at the last like 3 games or so, he's been getting some targets, and the targets are valuable. But with running backs, I'm kind of suspect on like if they'll continue to get targets. I mean, half of Patterson's like 24 or 23 snaps last game, he lined up as a receiver. So I mean, that's kind of you have that aspect to it. But like if you look at his snaps, he played in 23 snaps, right? Other guys that played 23 snaps, Darrell Williams had 24. Josiah, oh no, that's a tight end. James Prochet had snaps. Like, there's a bunch of guys that you never even think once would be relevant for fantasy that have similar snap shares. Like, that's how sustainable it is. Deshaun Jackson has a similar snap share to Cordero Patterson. Like,
but do you think that those touches are different? Because you could say the same thing. There was back in the day when we played. Obviously, there was a running back, Brandon Jacobs was his name, right? So he didn't play very much, but when he played, he came in and got touchdowns. So he ended up finishing the season with like 500 yards rushing, but like 14, 15 touchdowns, something like that. I don't know the exact numbers, so don't quote me. But he was a valuable weekly flex type option because he would come in and score. And like that was just what he was known for. Do you think Cordero Patterson has a chance to replicate a season like that? Or you just like, as a fantasy expert, you're just like, no, I'm staying away because it's unsustainable?
I think I'm just staying away because it's unsustainable. I mean, you're expecting a lot of touchdowns from him at this point. Like, he scored 3 in one game, 2 in another game. I think he had 1 in another game. So that's, a lot of touchdowns so far. That's definitely sustainable. Especially on the limited amount of snaps that he's been on. Like, even if he looks good to you, like when you're watching the game, he looks explosive. He looks like, he can make plays. He's been a gadget player his whole career.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you like to say Mike Davis's career backup, but anytime Mike Davis has actually gotten an opportunity and gotten 60% of the snaps or more, he's actually produced. Like, you can look back at it, like his minimum points is like 8.
Yeah.
And he just needs the touchdowns. That's it.
Like, he needs the touchdowns, man. He needs the talent. That's what he needs, man. I ain't mad at him. He just needs the talent.
Doesn't matter. He just needs the touchdowns.
Well, I want to kind of transition to go ahead.
Arbitrary line. You just happen to be on the red zone and you just cross the line. Like, it's as simple as that. The scoring overall in fantasy is kind of, stupid like that. But, it makes Mike Davis valuable because he gets those red zone targets and touches in general. So,
I hear you on it. So it kind of makes me think of another situation, another 2 players that you and I have talked back and forth on over another team that wears red, the Arizona Cardinals, right? So we have Chase Edmonds and James Conner, okay? And so for me, it reminds me a little bit of it, but I think that the roles are reversed. The more explosive player is the starter right now, and the player that is more touchdown dependent is the backup. So for me, I'm looking at Chase Edmonds, I'm looking at James Conner, and I know you're looking at, okay, who's getting the valuable touchdown, the red zone looks, right? Mm-hmm. And so obviously James Conner is the goal line back there. He's getting those value touches that you crave. Talk to me a little bit about that in your assessment, because to me, obviously right now, Chase Edmonds is a top 12 running back locked in. Mm-hmm. James Conner's had a couple good games, but those have been really touchdown dependent. And so for me, I look at players and I'm like, okay, Chase Edmonds to me has a super high floor. He hasn't scored a touchdown and he's still in RB1 in 12-team leagues.
Yeah.
James Conner has a super low floor because if he doesn't score 1 touchdown, he's not startable. So where's your assessment on those 2 players and kind of just your thought process on how you value them?
So this is kind of more of a, how you want to approach your matchups type of question, because, like you said, Connor does, or Edmonds does have the higher like floor because of the receptions. But the thing with Edmonds is it's going to be harder for him to score touchdowns if he's not getting work in the red zone. You know what I'm saying? So, James Conner is like consistently been getting the red zone work. He's punched it in for 2 touchdowns 2 weeks in a row. Like he got you 20 points 2 weeks in a row. So if you start James Conner, like you're hoping for a touchdown or two, right?
Right.
But and then if he has a bad game, it's like what, 4 to 8 points maybe.
If that, yeah.
Yeah, if that. But like at the end of the day, it doesn't really help you to get like 10 from Edmonds versus 4 from, Connor. Like it doesn't, swing that much. Like if you have a bad game from either one of them, it's probably not really swinging you in the direction of winning or losing. If that makes sense.
It does, but I also look at it as okay, Connor, unless he has a touchdown, like if he got you 40 and a touchdown, that seems like an average. Like okay, Connor got you
Yeah.
in a good game, like he got you the touchdown, so that's 10 points. For me, if Chase Edmonds isn't getting you 5 catches a game with probably 50 on the ground and 50 receiving, like a 15-point floor, that's what I'm depending on. I know you had to invest a little bit more draft capital to get
Yeah.
him. But to me, a 15-point floor in fantasy, when you only start 9 players, I think it is for most leagues, are somewhere between 8 and 10 players that you're starting. You start 9 players, let's say, that's valuable to me. And it's valuable to have that floor with the upside that if he does score a touchdown or happens to get loose for 2, now you're talking about a 20-point player. I think there's
Yeah.
no way, shape, or form where James Conner ever gets 6 catches, 3 touchdowns, and 100. You know what I'm saying? Like 100 yards. He can't have a Chase Edmonds type game.
But here's the thing, right? I wouldn't say that completely either because, Edmonds is actually, he missed practice with a shoulder injury. I know I, texted that in the Discord, right? And, if James Conner is the only back in that backfield and Edmonds doesn't play or like anything happens to Edmonds, James Conner is a league winner. He's gonna get receiving like work after that. And he's gonna be a workhorse. But if anything happened to James Conner, Edmonds isn't gonna really be the workhorse. I mean,
How?
they'd probably have somebody else come in and get those.
No, not a chance, bro. It'd be the same. I think it's the same thing with either one of them.
Listen, Kenyon Drake last year took all the red zone touches. This year it's James Conner. They clearly don't trust them whatsoever down there. Clearly, like because
I think it's one of those things when you have a back that's smaller. You don't want to put him through that if you don't have to. Right? And he's on a contract year too. Chase Edmonds is in a contract year, so obviously he's just trying to prove that he can handle a 20 touch day, a 15 to 20 touch day. That's what he's trying to prove contract wise. James Conner proved that already in Pittsburgh. He can't handle a workhorse role, but what he can handle is a power back. He proved it. That's why he went to Arizona on the backup deal.
You got to look back at the history of he's actually finished with a workhorse role. I think he was the RB9 in what year? Hold on.
He had one year where he was really good. I'll give him that.
He's actually proven and done it before. Edmonds has never done it before.
Exactly, but I think when it comes to Chase Edmonds, to me, the potential of what Chase Edmonds can do is really scary to me because if James Conner goes down, I think he's a featured back. He already is. He's limited with the floor. I mean, he has a high floor, right? So Chase Edmonds ever gets another 5 to 10 touches in a game, yeah, the injury risk might go up, but that to me is league winner. You give Chase Edmonds another 5 to 10 touches a game, whether they bring in another backup or not, I think that's more league winner than James Conner is because James Conner is probably still not getting the passing game work.
Well, he did get targeted once last game. So
hey, step up. Step up.
But James Conner, I just looked it up. In 2018, he finished as the RB7. Like, that's what I'm thinking. Like, if he gets a workhorse role, I think he can actually do it. He's had some injuries the past couple years, but he's not, I wouldn't focus on the fact that, your opinion by watching him, you don't think he's talented or something like that. Like,
he's a long way removed from 2018. That's 3 years ago. And he hasn't performed at that level since then. Yeah,
the thing is, like, I think it's just situation. Like, Pittsburgh's been kind of, here and there with, their situation the last couple of years. I don't think that's on Conner. I mean, Conner's been hurt. You can't really fault him for that. But, even if he's not as good as he was in 2018, I don't think that really matters all that much, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think that's where you, as a fantasy, whoever's watching right now, as a fantasy player, you have to determine where you're buying into. Are you buying into the fact that players get hurt, players have reputations, or are you looking at situation? And I think it's easy to do both. Like I could probably there's probably a player on my board where I'm like on your side too, where I'm using kind of that same analysis is like, nah. But then there's players I like for whatever reason. There's players that you like that you kind of shy away from some information. We all have very similar information, and it's what we do with that information as fantasy players to make the right decisions. And one of those topics that I want to go in with you that we actually
Oh, froze.
I think have a pretty similar is drafting running backs in your draft and having to kind of break away from that old strategy of like you have to go running back, running back, running back in the first round. Connor, you have a really good take on this. We had a draft Bible. If you didn't purchase it, you missed out on some great information. But we talked about this in our draft kit our draft Bible. The zero RB / hero RB strategy, man. What's your thoughts on this? Because to me, getting three running backs is super outdated and the easiest way to guarantee yourself a middling type of team
Hmm.
with limited upside.
Maybe even like maybe even less than middling. You might even be like last place because if you don't hit on those running backs, you're screwed. Like you're not going anywhere. Because it is really difficult to even hit on your early round running backs because they don't hit. They don't have a high hit rate, right? A lot of running backs get injured more than receivers do. You saw this year, CMC's already gone down.
Man,
Dalvin Cook be banged up. Derrick Henry has had games here and there where he's like not been that good. If you
yep.
drafted him high, you're probably a little
I
disappointed.
mean, Joe Mixon's out. We lost J.K. Dobbins, Chris Carson's out. Like the numbers are starting to stack up already.
Exactly. So, and you also have to look at like what position scores more and has more opportunities to score more. You look at receivers like, and especially in PPR,
PPR, yes.
you know, they get all those targets, right? And then especially you add in red zone targets and deep targets. Running backs aren't getting deep targets.
Yeah.
Targets are ultra valuable. So like, if you go and you weight touches by their value, wide receivers are going to be way better most of the time, right?
And
And
what about those tight ends who damn near play receiver, man? Because to me, those guys are exponentially more valuable than like a Joe Mixon in the middle of the second round, or even like Antonio Gibson had a lot of hype coming into the year. To me, he was damn near same draft capital as Travis Kelsey. Like in Darren Waller, to me, Darren Waller was going after those guys, which to me, looking back on it's insane. If I have Darren Waller, there's no way in hell I'm trading him for Joe Mixon, a Chris Carson, one of those back end RB1 or high end RB2 types. No way I'm making that deal.
right. So with the thing with tight ends though is this is where I think we vary a little bit. I know you have Kelsey, right, the number one. And
Right.
you have your other elite tight ends, but Kittle had kind of a slow start.
Yep.
Waller had a couple good games. Hawkinson had some games. I think with tight end, you can get by a little bit more with like getting some later round guys. We've seen Dawson Knox kind of be a pretty good tight end to own the last few weeks, and Logan Thomas is always pretty solid. Gesicki, I think, there's a lot of guys you could just start. I mean, you're gonna have some bad performances, but like at the end of the day, I think it's more valuable early on to get your top receivers still. Because I don't like say you draft Kelsey and then this is the year he falls off. Like you never know. He's been doing it for so long. Like it's kind of like, yeah, maybe that's why you would draft him is because he's been doing it for so long. But also like it's kind of like, oh, where's the fall off gonna happen here?
But I think that's the tough part in fantasy is when do you predict the fall off, right? Because one player I know, like for me, I look at this player and I'm like, there has to be a fall off soon, but predicting is tough. Ezekiel Elliott. I know at some point in the next 3 years, Ezekiel Elliott is going to be a non-factor in fantasy football. That's just the nature of the running back position. By the time they hit 26 to 28 in
Yep.
that range, the drop off is inevitable. It happens. And Zeke is going to come up on that here very soon. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people are looking at Tony Pollard right now as like, hey, you got to go get this guy, stash him because he's got next. But to me, I think Zeke this year is going to finish off pretty similar to last year, maybe at 80%, 80% range of what he did at his top peak. Like I think Zeke finishes that way.
Yeah.
How are you evaluating like when the drop off comes? Because it's super important to know that in fantasy, like to kind of be like, all right, Dalvin Cook is going to be running up here on an injury here soon because he hasn't been injured for so long. Or this player is going to bounce back because they were injured. A lot of people are negative on them. Here's their time to shine. Like you kind of buying low and selling high almost. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, every position has their different career arcs. And I think it's really important to understand, positional, career arcs and how long these players generally stay in the league and are productive, right? I actually made a Google spreadsheet and I looked at like,
Dude, your spreadsheets are crazy, bro. Like
yeah,
people need to tap in. I hope people watch this. They need to tap in, man. We got to shout out your Twitter and shit too, because people need to see that stuff, man.
yeah, my Twitter is cplant underscore. I think it's only one underscore, but yeah, and you can see all the weighted touches that I break down, and all my little personal takes a little bit, but they're fueled by the data.
Yep.
I'm not for most part, I'm not going off of what I subjectively see. I'm going off the objective data that I'm seeing every day. But if you look at career arcs, a guy that I kind of had a feeling was his top fantasy days are kind of over was Robert Woods. Like if you look at his career arc, he's been a top solid receiver year over year, right? But like he's old. He's been in the league for a while. Like, would you rather have the young like ascending star in Cooper Kupp? I mean, this was even before the draft. Like, would you rather have the young ascending star in Cooper Kupp? I think he was a wide receiver 2 in 2019. Or would you rather have, the guy that's kind of like been middle of the road, you never know exactly when he's going to fall off, but he probably will soon because he's been in the league for a long time.
Well, that was a big talking point too in the offseason was like who's going to be the Rams' number one receiver. And a lot of people, there was a ton of people who were saying Robert Woods is going to be the number one wide receiver. We actually got a question here I want to get answered too
Okay.
before we go on. But a lot of people were talking about Cooper Kupp versus Robert Woods. And it was like, to me, the obvious answer was Cooper Kupp. He was more valuable in the red zone the entire time he's been there with Robert Woods. They would alternate. But Cooper Kupp was like getting those more valuable touches outside of some of the deep shots we're talking about. Let's pin that conversation and come to Dante's question. Dante, what's going on? Appreciate you tapping in. Said, what value can I get for Julio Jones right now? He's my flex. And to me, Julio Jones is tough because you're selling all name value right now. And I know you're shaking your head because you don't find him valuable, I'm assuming. But the name value was still there. And especially in leagues like if you're not playing in a super competitive league, you might be able to say, hey, Julio Jones is coming back. I don't mind Julio Jones as like a wide receiver 3 with upside when he plays. What kind of value do you see with Julio Jones, and what kind of player would you be targeting?
Okay. So it's tricky with Julio because, he's, older. He's, he's always had a problem in his career of scoring touchdowns somehow. I mean, touchdowns are pretty variable. But I think for Julio Jones right now, you got to try to sell him like ASAP because, it doesn't look good for him end of the season. I mean, there's probably going to be somebody in your league that's like higher on him than consensus. So, you try to ship him to that guy in your league and then, try to get a younger guy like Pittman. I love Pittman or
Yep.
Myers. Jacoby Myers hasn't scored a touchdown yet in his whole career.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking about that, off camera. He's never scored a touchdown his whole career. He's bound to get a touchdown at some point. I think, you get Myers, you get Pittman, someone like that who's, being undervalued, but is like a younger guy and, gets the targets, you're going to be better off, I think.
Yeah, and I'm not big on Jacoby Myers, and that's a whole conversation for another day. But the way that I play this is I look for, I try to balance this deal out, right? And so my thought process is, somebody's going to value Julio Jones, but they might value somebody else. So say I got a Cordero Patterson on my roster. Say I have another player who's kind of performing, a Dawson Knox. What I would do is pair Julio Jones up with a Dawson Knox, and now they'll get a better tight end. So now I would look for, is Kyle Pitts kind of underperforming? Let me pair Julio Jones up and Dawson Knox, somebody I don't have a lot of capital in, not a lot invested in, to go get a more elite player. George Kittle's been struggling. Okay, can I pair up Julio Jones and Dawson Knox or Julio Jones and Dallas Goedert and go get a George Kittle from the owner who's looking at these guys like, I'm not interested in them anymore. I would try to find elite players who are playing at a lower level and pair up Julio Jones with another player who's overperforming your expectations, Cordero Patterson, a Dawson Knox, even a Michael Pittman, some of those guys with really good upside. Somebody that you didn't invest a lot of draft capital in to go get a better player who is locked in at their value. So Dante, that's a very good question. If you got
Yeah.
any more, go ahead and shoot them out. You're getting some expert level help right now from us because we got no other viewers right now. So if you're watching and you got some comments, man, throw them in there. We'll help you out.
Yeah. I mean, that was a good question because, Julio is, he's got the big name, but you don't know what to do with him at this point because it's like he's been injured, you don't, like, it's hard, you know?
I think with Julio, we knew coming in that he would have some type of fall off, right? You're like, okay, he's coming in a situation, run heavy team, already has the number one receiver established. And then you're like, okay, well, maybe he's going to get some of those vacated targets from Corey Davis. Obviously, Jonnu Smith is gone. There wasn't a lot left. And sorry, I know I'm probably butchering the stats. I know. Don't laugh at me, Connor, man. It ain't funny.
Just,
But you expect him to come into the role and be able to play like, okay, say he's 80% of Julio Jones. For the most part, you still got a wide receiver too.
yeah,
But you have to look at the nature of the offense. Tannehill's not throwing for 5,000 yards. He's not throwing for 4,500 most years. He's probably going to be somewhere in that 3,500 to 4,000 range, maybe a little higher with the 17-game season. So there's not a lot of room for like Julio Jones to be a wide receiver 2 or better. So when
yeah,
I look at Julio Jones, to me, it was like he looks like the declining asset we were talking about is when is he going to fall off? This looked like the perfect year. If you didn't count last year already as a fall off,
yeah.
this looked like the year that the nosedive was going to start to happen.
He was still very good last year if you look at, all the advanced metrics. But, at some point every player falls off. And you mentioned vacated targets, which, I also, wanted to talk about a little bit because, kind of like you said before, vacated touches, it's not really a thing. I'm sorry, but
Okay.
you look at it,
Explain. I want to hear this.
there isn't, targets from the other player that come to the new team the next year. That's not how it works. Maybe it's like more like vacated snaps is probably more similar to what it is because targets are something the player earns, right?
Okay.
If, Julio earns a certain amount of targets, it doesn't mean Kyle Pitts. Like people are like, oh, Kyle Pitts is going to take Julio Jones' old targets. That's not really the case. I mean, he's getting targeted, but he's getting Kyle Pitts targets. He's not getting Julio Jones targets. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's all in what the player, can attract. The player itself is the one that's, drawing the targets. You can't be like just plug and play and this isn't Madden. Like you're not gonna plug and play this player and bring him in from this team and he's gonna get the same amount of targets as the former guy. Like it's not like that. He's not gonna get the same targets either, right? Unless they're an offensive role. But I think that's a big fallacy that people always say, oh, vacated targets this, vacated touches this. But it's not that. It's just like they're going to have their own role. They're going to have their own touches. That's what you have to focus on more because you could get so caught up in, whatever team has the most vacated touches. But if you look in history, like if you just based off your analysis on vacated targets, then it wouldn't work out for you.
Man, some good points, man. We'll have to double back on this conversation, Connor. And this is a good, I think, a good start for us, man. We should do this more often for sure. Maybe we'll do something like a weekly or bi-weekly basis.
Yeah.
But let people know where to find you.
Oh yeah. So on Twitter, cplant_, and then I just joined TikTok with that same username, and I'll try my best to try to start posting content on there too. But yeah, I think my Twitter is very valuable. I think for you guys to go check out, and if you don't even have to follow me, there's a feature on Twitter where you can like make a list and you just add me onto there and with your other fantasy football analysts,
Yep.
and yeah. So if you have any questions too, my DMs on Twitter are always open. Like anybody can go in and ask me, pick my brain or whatever. I know like I'm not that known, but like
You know your shit though. People need to know that you know your shit. So
yeah.
yes, sir.
Appreciate
All right, Connor, appreciate you, my man. And you're not following the Fantasy Gods, follow us on all platforms, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, you name it, we're on there. Justin Henry signing off. Connor LaPlante, stat analyst. We out.
Peace.